The lake did not disappear all at once. It left 6 inches at a time, and that was enough to make a $1.8 million resort look very nervous. At 6:17 that morning, I stood beside the concrete control structure at the south end of Mercer Lake with one boot near the staff gauge and a mug of coffee cooling in my hand. Mist hovered above the water. The air smelled like wet stone, pine needles, and the dark lake mud beginning to show along the shoreline. I leaned closer to the gauge, 6 inches below normal pool, exactly where the maintenance schedule said it should be by then. Across the lake, Pine Hollow's floating dock sat at an awkward angle against its guideposts. The artificial beach looked wider than it had the day before, and the kayak launch ended several feet farther from usable water. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was flooding. The water was simply no longer sitting where Patricia Caldwell expected it to sit. My phone started vibrating against the metal toolbox beside me. Her name filled the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Daniel, what did you do to our lake?" No good morning. No explanation. Just that sentence. I looked across the water toward the resort clubhouse, its stone patio and wedding deck glowing pale gold through the mist. "Your lake?" I asked. Silence. Then I heard papers moving on her end. "The water level is dropping. Guests are already complaining. The dock is becoming unusable." "I can see that." "Then stop whatever you are doing." Behind me, water moved steadily through the control structure with a low mechanical rush. Not violent. Not dramatic. Controlled. Measured. Documented. The same way my father had maintained this property for years before Pine Hollow started advertising lakefront weddings. Patricia's voice sharpened. "You cannot drain a community lake because you are angry about a violation." I looked down at the blue inspection binder resting beside my coffee. Survey. Maintenance logs. Inspection schedule. Certified notice receipt. Every page exactly where it belonged. "I am not draining a community lake." Another silence. This one lasted longer. "Close the gate, Daniel." I glanced at the steel control wheel. Cold morning condensation still covered the rim. "Inspection is scheduled. You are going to hear from our attorney. Have them call." She disconnected. I slipped the phone into my pocket and walked 20 yards up the bank until I could see the north shoreline clearly. 3 weeks earlier, there had been a bridge there. Timber deck. Steel supports. Weathered handrail. My father had built most of it with his own hands, and I had spent 2 summers helping him replace boards and tighten bolts. Now there was an empty gap between 2 sections of shoreline and fresh marks where contractor equipment had crossed the gravel. Patricia had called that bridge a violation. She had sent people onto my property with an excavator and paperwork carrying the Pine Hollow Homeowners Association logo. She believed removing it would settle an argument about who controlled the shoreline. What she did not understand was that the bridge had never been the most important piece of infrastructure on my 27 acres. I looked back at the staff gauge. 6 inches. Across the lake, someone from the resort was already walking down toward the stranded kayak launch. 3 weeks earlier, Patricia had destroyed the bridge my father built. That was the morning I finally opened his blue binder and learned exactly what Pine Hollow's expensive lakefront view depended on. 4 months earlier, Mercer Lake still looked like the kind of place people assumed had always existed exactly as they found it. 27 acres of hardwoods and sloping pasture wrapped around dark blue water in western North Carolina, with my house tucked behind a stand of white pines and the old control structure sitting low at the southern end. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 49, and before I started managing the property full-time, I spent 23 years as a civil construction superintendent working around drainage systems, culverts, retaining walls, grading, and small water control structures. Water taught me patience. It always finds the elevation you give it, not the one you wish it had. My father understood that long before I did. He maintained the lake for decades and recorded almost everything in a blue binder he kept in a steel cabinet inside his workshop. Inspection dates, water elevations, gate servicing, repairs, even handwritten notes about unusually heavy rain. I used to tease him about documenting things nobody would ever read. He would tap the binder and say, "Nobody cares about records until somebody needs them." The bridge was different. That was personal. It crossed a narrow inlet on the north side, about 40 feet from bank to bank, built from heavy timber decking over steel supports. Dad started it when I was 26. I spent weekends beside him measuring boards, tightening bolts, and carrying lumber while cicadas screamed from the trees. By the time we finished, my hands were blistered, and he was already talking about which boards would need replacing first. 20 years later, I could still recognize the heads of bolts I had tightened myself. Across the water sat Pine Hollow. When my father was alive, it was mostly a quiet residential development with a modest clubhouse near the shoreline. Then Patricia Caldwell became Homeowners Association president. Within 2 years, contractors transformed the clubhouse property into something much more ambitious. Stone terraces, a wedding deck, kayak racks, a floating dock, fresh landscaping, an artificial beach. The association reportedly put about $1,800,000 into the renovation, and soon glossy community material started calling it the Pine Hollow Lakeside Resort. The phrase always made me smile because Pine Hollow owned property beside the lake, not the lake itself. Still, I had no interest in fighting over marketing language. Their residents enjoyed the view. I enjoyed my land. For a while, that arrangement worked. Then Patricia started treating proximity like ownership. The first letter arrived in May. She called my bridge visually inconsistent with Pine Hollow shoreline standards and requested that I submit renovation plans to the architectural committee. I read the letter twice, checked the parcel map, and mailed back a short response explaining that the bridge sat entirely on Mercer property. 2 weeks later, another notice arrived. This one called the structure an aesthetic concern affecting shared lake views. I filed it beside the first. Then Patricia came herself. She stood near the north inlet in a cream jacket and expensive shoes, staring at the weathered timber railing. "It looks neglected," she said. I ran my hand across a board my father had installed. "It is maintained. Our resort guests see it every day. Then they see a bridge." Her smile tightened. "Daniel, the shoreline affects everyone." I looked across the water toward her new stone terrace. "That does not make it yours." She left without another word. 10 days later, at 6:08 in the morning, I woke to diesel, hydraulic machinery, and the unmistakable metallic clatter of equipment coming from the north shoreline. The sound reached me before I saw the equipment. Diesel rumbling through the trees. Hydraulic pressure rising and falling. Steel chain rattling against something heavy. I pulled on my boots, grabbed my phone, and headed down the north trail. Morning fog still floated over Mercer Lake, but halfway through the pines I could smell fresh-cut timber and disturbed soil. Then I saw the excavator. It was parked beside the inlet with Pine Hollow contractor markings on a pickup nearby. One section of my bridge railing was already gone. Several deck boards had been removed and stacked on the bank, and a worker was preparing equipment beside the remaining structure. Patricia stood near the gravel access path, holding a white folder against her cream jacket. I stopped about 30 feet away and started recording. "Everybody stop working, please." The contractor turned first. Patricia did not. She looked at me as if I had arrived late to a meeting she had scheduled. "Daniel, this structure has been cited repeatedly. You are standing on my property." The contractor looked from Patricia to me. "Sir, we were told the association had authority over shoreline structures. They do not have authority over this one." Patricia opened her folder and held up a notice bearing the Pine Hollow logo. "You were given adequate opportunity to correct the violation." I kept my phone pointed toward the bridge, the equipment, and the survey pin. Near the tree line, "A notice from your association does not transfer ownership." Her expression tightened. Behind her, the excavator idled with a low mechanical vibration I could feel through the ground. I asked the contractor for his company name and work order number. He gave me both. Then I asked who authorized the job. He pointed toward Patricia without saying anything. That was enough. I photographed the pickup plate, the equipment, the removed boards, the work order he showed me, and every visible part of the bridge. I did not touch their machinery. I did not argue with the crew. I simply told the contractor clearly that I was the property owner and that I did not consent to further work. He shut down the excavator. The sudden silence felt enormous. Water tapped softly against the remaining steel supports. Patricia stepped closer, stopping several feet away. "This shoreline affects property values throughout Pine Hollow. That still does not make it yours. You are refusing every reasonable solution." I looked at the missing railing and the stack of boards beside the bank. "You brought excavation equipment onto land you do not own before sunrise. We have different definitions of reasonable." For the first time, the contractor looked uncomfortable. Patricia closed the folder. "Our council will address this." "Good. Have them include the survey." She turned toward her vehicle without answering. Within 20 minutes, the crew had packed up and left, but the damage was already done. The bridge stood incomplete over the inlet, exposed bolt holes catching the morning light where the railing had been. I walked onto the remaining deck and rested my hand on one weathered timber. My father had marked the underside of that beam with the installation year in black carpenter's pencil. I could still see the faded numbers. That afternoon, I called my attorney, saved copies of the camera footage, and pulled the parcel survey from the workshop. Then I opened the steel cabinet looking for the bridge records. The blue binder was wedged behind a stack of old inspection reports. When I pulled it free, dust rolled across the workbench. I expected repair notes and water elevations. What I found instead was a maintenance history that reached back decades, along with property documents describing the lake's control structure in language I had never needed to study closely before. I sat down and started reading. By sunset, the broken bridge was no longer the only thing on my mind. The first thing that caught my attention was not a legal phrase. It was a number written in my father's block handwriting beside a maintenance entry from 14 years earlier. Normal pool elevation. He had underlined it twice. I turned the page and found another entry documenting a controlled drawdown for inspection of the downstream face and outlet components. Then another, 5 years later. Dates, water levels, weather conditions, gate positions, photographs tucked into plastic sleeves. My father had documented Mercer Lake the same way I used to document commercial drainage projects. Assume nothing, measure everything. I spread the blue binder across the workbench and pulled the parcel records beside it. The control structure at the south end of the lake sat entirely within Mercer property. So did the access path, the operating hardware, and the land surrounding it. What I could not find was equally important. There was no agreement promising Pine Hollow a permanent recreational water elevation. No document requiring my family to maintain the lake at a particular level for their dock. No guarantee that kayaks, weddings, or artificial beaches would always have water exactly where the association wanted it. I called my attorney the next morning. I did not ask whether I could empty the lake. I asked him to review the property documents and tell me exactly what obligations existed. While he worked through those records, I called a qualified dam and water control inspector who had serviced properties in the county for years. I sent him photographs, maintenance logs, and the latest inspection notes. He noticed something I had nearly overlooked. The control structure was due for a periodic inspection, and several submerged areas near the inlet and shoreline could be evaluated more thoroughly at a reduced pool elevation. How far down? I asked. That depends on the inspection plan and site conditions, he said. We do it gradually. Gradually. That word mattered. I wanted documentation, not drama. Over the next several days, I verified the procedure, checked downstream conditions, reviewed the operating records, and made sure any required notifications were handled before anything changed. My attorney eventually called back. His conclusion was careful but clear. Based on the records he reviewed, Pine Hollow did not have a contractual right to demand that I maintain normal pools solely for its recreational amenities. I asked him to put that in writing. Then I looked across the lake at the resort. From my side, it was almost beautiful enough to understand Patricia's confidence. Stone terrace, white umbrellas, kayak racks, floating dock. Everything had been designed around one assumption. The water would always be there. Patricia had spent $1,800,000 improving property beside a lake whose operating records apparently had never interested her. I opened the association letters again. Bridge violation, shared shoreline standards, community aesthetics. Not one mentioned the dam. Not one mentioned water control rights. That afternoon, I prepared a certified notice informing Pine Hollow that a scheduled maintenance inspection would involve a gradual controlled reduction in lake level. I included dates and contact information. I did not mention the bridge beyond preserving my separate claim concerning the unauthorized work. 2 days later, Patricia called. I received your ridiculous notice. I was standing beside the staff gauge when she said it. Then I know delivery worked. You cannot lower a community lake. I looked at the measurement marks disappearing beneath the calm water. Have your attorney send me the document that says that. She went quiet. This is retaliation. The inspection is documented, scheduled, and being handled through the proper process. Cancel it. No. She disconnected. I wrote the time of the call in the blue binder. Then I closed it and looked toward the broken bridge on the opposite inlet. Patricia had mistaken my patience for permission once already. I was not going to make the same mistake with the water. The inspection morning arrived cool and gray, with mist sitting low over Mercer Lake and beads of condensation shining on the steel control wheel. I reached the south end before sunrise carrying the blue binder, a flashlight, my phone, and a thermos of coffee. The inspector arrived shortly afterward in a white pickup and spent nearly an hour reviewing the control structure, downstream conditions, operating records, and the planned sequence before anything changed. I appreciated that. Water does not reward impatience. Neither does infrastructure. When everything was ready, we documented the staff gauge at normal pool, photographed the shoreline, and recorded the starting time. Then the controlled drawdown began. There was no dramatic rush across the lake. No sudden wall of water. Just the low mechanical sound of the control structure operating and a steady movement downstream within the planned conditions. I stood beside the gauge and watched the first measurable change appear. 1 inch. Later, 2. The wet line on the rocks began showing beneath the normal water level. By afternoon, dark bands of exposed shoreline traced the lake like pencil marks. Across from me, Pine Hollow still looked normal. The wedding deck remained above the water. The clubhouse windows reflected the sky. People walked along the stone terrace carrying coffee. Nobody seemed concerned yet. The next morning, the gauge showed another controlled reduction. The floating dock sat slightly lower against its access ramp. The artificial beach had gained several feet of damp sand. A maintenance worker stood near the kayak racks looking toward the water with his hands on his hips. My phone rang at 8:14. Patricia. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, a message appeared. Call me immediately. I wrote the time in the binder. By the third morning, the difference could no longer be dismissed as normal fluctuation. The resort dock remained in place, but convenient water access was shrinking. Kayaks that had once been carried a few steps to the shoreline now faced exposed wet ground. The edge of the lake had pulled away from. Decorative stones Pine Hollow had arranged around its beach. Patricia arrived just before 9 in her dark sport utility vehicle and walked down the service path toward the control structure. She stopped behind the marked work area. Daniel. I turned from the staff gauge. Her face was tight, but her voice stayed controlled. Close it. The inspection is still underway. We have a wedding this weekend. I received your notice about the resort schedule. Then you understand what this is doing. I looked toward the inspector, who was checking measurements near the structure. I understand exactly what the water level is doing. Patricia held up her phone. Our dock contractor says another several inches could affect recreational access. Then your dock contractor should plan around the documented maintenance elevation. She stared at me. You are enjoying this. I closed the blue binder. No, I enjoyed my bridge. That stopped her. For a moment, all I could hear was water moving through the structure and a woodpecker somewhere in the pines. Patricia looked across the lake toward the resort, then back at me. Restore the normal level, and we can discuss the bridge. The bridge was already mine when you decided to discuss it with an excavator. Her expression changed. Less anger now. Calculation. Our attorney will contact yours. That is where this should have started. She left without another word. By sunset, the staff gauge showed 6 inches below normal pool. I photographed it, recorded the time, and added the measurement to the maintenance log. Across Mercer Lake, the $1,800,000 resort was still standing exactly where it had always stood. The only thing disappearing was the assumption that the water belonged to it. By Friday morning, the shoreline had changed enough that even someone who had never looked at a staff gauge could see it. Damp clay formed a dark ribbon around Mercer Lake. Rocks that had been underwater all summer were exposed to the cool air, and the resort's artificial beach stretched farther toward the retreating water. The drawdown remained gradual and within the documented inspection plan. I recorded every measurement, every time, and every condition in the blue binder. The inspector did the same. Nothing about the process was improvised. That mattered because Patricia had stopped calling me directly. Now the calls came through attorneys. Mine contacted me shortly after 9. Pine Hollow's counsel wanted copies of the documents supporting the maintenance work and the ownership records connected to the control structure. Send them, I said. All of them. Everything relevant. An hour later, scanned copies of the survey, inspection history, maintenance schedule, certified notice, and property documents were on their way. Then my attorney asked me to forward the footage from the morning Patricia's contractor entered my property. I sent that too. By lunch, the argument had changed. Pine Hollow was no longer demanding that I immediately restore what Patricia called their lake. Their attorney was asking what agreement governed normal pool elevation. My attorney's answer was simple. Show us the one you believe exists. That afternoon, I walked to the north inlet. The damaged bridge looked worse with the water lower. More of the steel supports were visible beneath the remaining deck, along with the clean spaces where boards and railing had been removed. I photographed everything again. When I returned to the workshop, an email from Pine Hollow was waiting. They wanted a meeting Monday morning. Patricia would attend with the association attorney and 2 board members. I agreed. Monday arrived bright and windless. We met on the resort terrace overlooking the lake. Without the usual waterline, the place felt strangely unfinished. The floating dock remained intact, but its access geometry was awkward. The kayak launch was temporarily impractical. Beyond it, broad strips of exposed shoreline made the expensive landscaping look disconnected from the water it had been designed around. Patricia sat across from me with a folder closed beneath both hands. Her attorney began carefully. Mr. Mercer, we have reviewed the documents your counsel provided. I waited. At this time, we have not identified an agreement requiring you to maintain a fixed recreational pool. Elevation for Pine Hollow. Patricia immediately turned toward him. But this community has used the lake for years. Use is not the question we are discussing, he said. One board member leaned forward. Then what exactly did we spend $1,800,000 building around? Nobody answered immediately. I opened my blue binder and placed 3 photographs on the table. The bridge before the work. The contractor equipment on my property. The bridge afterward. That is my question too, I said. Patricia's face tightened. Those are separate issues. They were, I said, until your association treated private infrastructure as if your rules automatically controlled it. Her attorney looked at the photographs, then at the work order information I had preserved. He asked who had confirmed jurisdiction before the contractor was dispatched. Patricia started explaining shoreline standards. He interrupted gently. I am asking who verified ownership. Silence settled over the terrace. Somewhere behind us, a resort employee dragged an empty kayak rack farther from the exposed mud. The scraping sound carried across the stone. One of the board members looked toward Patricia. Did we get a survey before authorizing this? Patricia did not answer. I did not need her to. For the first time since the excavator appeared at sunrise, Pine Hollow was finally asking the question it should have asked before touching my bridge. The meeting did not end with an apology. It ended with Patricia asking for 48 hours. I agreed because by then patience was costing me nothing and costing Pine Hollow plenty of questions. The controlled drawdown had reached the planned inspection elevation, so the water level stabilized while the inspector examined exposed shoreline areas, outlet components, and sections of the structure that were easier to evaluate at the lower pool. I documented the reading on the staff gauge and left the operating configuration exactly where the inspection plan required. Across the lake, the resort looked almost normal from a distance. Up close, the illusion was gone. The floating dock no longer met the shoreline the way its designers intended. Damp earth surrounded decorative stones. The kayak launch pointed toward a strip of exposed lakebed. The buildings were untouched, the landscaping was intact, and nobody was in danger. Pine Hollow had simply discovered how much of its expensive experience depended on water elevation it had never secured by agreement. 48 hours later, my attorney forwarded a letter from the association's counsel. The language was very different from Patricia's notices. No mention of a community lake. No demand that I obey shoreline standards. Instead, Pine Hollow proposed resolving the bridge damage and discussing a formal agreement concerning future recreational water level expectations. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I opened the blue binder and placed the letter behind my father's maintenance records. That evening, one of the board members called me directly. His name was Robert Hayes, and his voice sounded tired. Daniel, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Did Patricia ever tell you the resort project assumed the lake would remain at normal pool through the recreation season? No. He paused. Did anyone ask you to sign an agreement before construction? No. Another pause. That is what I thought. The next Pine Hollow board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night. I attended with my attorney and the binder under my arm. More homeowners showed up than I expected. Patricia sat at the front table beneath recessed lights, her cream jacket replaced by a dark blazer, a stack of papers arranged perfectly in front of her. The association attorney explained the situation without drama. Mercer Lake's water control infrastructure was privately held. The records reviewed so far did not establish Pine Hollow's claimed authority over my bridge. The association also had not identified a contract guaranteeing a fixed recreational pool elevation for its amenities. Then Robert asked the question that changed the room. Who authorized the contractor to remove part of Mr. Mercer's bridge before confirming ownership? Patricia said the architectural committee had identified a shoreline violation. Robert shook his head. That was not my question. Papers rustled around the room. Another board member asked whether association funds had paid the contractor. The answer was yes. A homeowner near the back asked why a $1,800,000 renovation had been approved without securing the water level arrangement the dock and kayak facilities depended on. Patricia tried to separate the two issues again. This time, nobody let her. The attorney produced the contractor authorization. Her signature was at the bottom. I opened my binder and placed the survey beside it. One document showed who ordered the work. The other showed where the work happened. Patricia looked across the table at me. You could restore the water tomorrow if you wanted. I kept my hands on the binder. When the inspection is complete, I will operate my structure according to the documented plan. So this is about control. I looked through the clubhouse windows toward the exposed shoreline. No, Patricia. This is about knowing what you control before you spend someone else's money pretending you control everything else. The inspection wrapped up the following afternoon, but I did not touch the control wheel until the inspector finished his notes and photographed the final conditions. He found no emergency, no dramatic failure, and nothing that justified the kind of panic Patricia had tried to attach to the drawdown. What he did find were ordinary maintenance items, the kind my father had spent decades recording in that blue binder. We documented them, scheduled the work, and signed off on the inspection elevation. Only then did my attorney call with news from Pine Hollow. The board had opened a formal review of the bridge authorization and suspended Patricia's authority to approve outside contractor work while that review was underway. The association also wanted to settle the property damage claim rather than argue about jurisdiction they could no longer support with records. I drove to the north inlet that evening. The lower water exposed more of the bridge supports, making it easy to see exactly what had been removed and what remained sound. I ran my hand across the weathered timber my father had marked years earlier. For the first time since the excavator arrived, I could picture the bridge whole again. 2 days later, Pine Hollow's attorney sent a proposed settlement through mine. The association would cover the documented cost of restoring the removed railing and decking, reimburse related survey and inspection expenses tied to the dispute, and formally withdraw the shoreline violation notices issued against the bridge. Separate from that settlement, Pine Hollow requested negotiations for a written recreational water level agreement. That distinction mattered to me. They were finally treating my bridge as my property and the lake level as something requiring an agreement, not a privilege Patricia could invent with a letterhead. I agreed to discuss terms. Maintenance contributions, advance notice procedures, no unauthorized entry onto Mercer property, clear recognition that inspections and necessary operational changes could temporarily affect recreational water levels. My attorney handled the language. I handled the infrastructure. By the next board meeting, Patricia's signature on the contractor authorization had become impossible to explain away. Robert later told me the review found that she had pushed the removal forward without obtaining a boundary survey or confirming that Pine Hollow's architectural authority extended to my parcel. The board voted to require legal and ownership verification before future work involving property outside association boundaries. Patricia remained president only long enough to announce that she would not seek another term. There was no dramatic resignation speech, no shouting, just a short statement buried near the end of a meeting agenda. Somehow that felt more fitting. She had spent months trying to make authority look larger than it was. In the end, it became one line on a piece of paper. Restoration on my bridge started the following week. Fresh timber arrived on a flatbed, but I asked the contractor to preserve every original component that was still serviceable. When the new railing went up, I stood beside the same beam my father had marked with carpenter's pencil. Across the lake, Pine Hollow's resort remained surrounded by exposed shoreline. The wedding deck still stood. The clubhouse still shone at sunset. The $1,800,000 investment had not been destroyed. It had simply spent several weeks without the illusion that its view came with ownership of the water. Once the bridge restoration passed inspection and the dam maintenance work was complete, I returned to the south control structure with the blue binder under my arm. The operating plan called for the lake to begin returning gradually toward normal pool. I placed my hand on the cold steel wheel. Patricia had wanted me to restore the water because she demanded it. I had waited until the records, the inspection, and the property itself said it was time. The lake came back the same way it had gone down, slowly enough that you had to pay attention to notice. The first morning, the staff gauge climbed less than an inch. By the second afternoon, water had covered the darkest strip of exposed clay near the south bank. I recorded every reading in the blue binder, just as my father had done before me. There was no dramatic switch, no sudden transformation. Mercer Lake simply returned toward normal pool according to the operating plan. A week later, I walked across the restored bridge for the first time. Fresh timber blended with the older boards, and the repaired railing felt solid beneath my hand. The contractor had preserved the beam with my father's faded carpenter's pencil marks underneath. I crouched beside it for a moment and ran my thumb over the numbers. That mattered more to me than anything Patricia had ever written on association letterhead. Across the water, Pine Hollow was changing too. The floating dock gradually returned to its intended position. The kayak launch reached usable water again. The artificial beach narrowed as the lake rose. But this time, there was paperwork behind the view. After several rounds between attorneys, Pine Hollow signed a written agreement acknowledging Mercer ownership and operational control of the water control structure, establishing maintenance contributions, advance notice procedures, and clear expectations that inspections or necessary maintenance could temporarily change recreational water levels. The agreement also prohibited association contractors from entering Mercer property without permission or lawful authority. I signed only after my attorney was satisfied. Robert signed for Pine Hollow. Patricia did not. By then, she had completed her term and stepped away from the board. I saw her once afterward at the resort parking lot. She was getting into her sport utility vehicle when I drove past on the county road. She noticed me, paused, and then continued loading a folder into the passenger seat. Neither of us waved. Neither of us needed to. The argument had already been answered in surveys, maintenance logs, invoices, inspection reports, and one contractor authorization carrying her signature. By early fall, Mercer Lake reached normal operating level again. One evening, I carried coffee down to the north inlet as the sun dropped behind the hardwoods. Water moved quietly beneath the restored bridge. Across the lake, lights came on around Pine Hollow's stone terrace, and a couple stood near the wedding deck while someone arranged chairs behind them. The resort looked expensive again, maybe even beautiful. I did not resent that. I had never wanted their clubhouse ruined. I had wanted them to understand the difference between enjoying something and owning it. Before heading home, I walked to the south control structure and checked the staff gauge one last time. Normal pool. I wrote the reading and date in the blue binder, closed it, and rested my hand briefly on the cold steel wheel. My father had been right. Nobody cared about records until somebody needed them. Patricia thought an association notice could decide who controlled my bridge. Then she assumed a $1,800,000 renovation could somehow decide who controlled the lake beside it. In the end, I did not have to destroy anything she built. I only had to maintain what was mine, document every step, and let Pine Hollow discover what its resort had always depended on. I walked back across the bridge while the last orange light reflected off the water. She thought destroying my bridge would prove who controlled the shoreline. All it proved was that nobody at Pine Hollow had ever bothered asking who controlled the water.